Hey there, John Morris here, johnmorrisonline.com. Welcome back to another video. So yesterday I gave you my thoughts on WordPress Gutenberg and how I thought it's important that we start diving into it. So I kind of wanted today to start doing that and actually learning about this change that I think is inevitable and is going to really change the way things work in WordPress. So today I'm going to show you how to create your first Gutenberg block, which is sort of the foundation or the core element that Gutenberg runs on. So we're going to get into that. I've looked at a lot of the written tutorials that are out there. There's a lot of good stuff that's out there. But one thing I notice is they go sort of all in right away into this really complicated thing. And when I first wanted to start learning this, I just wanted something simple that I could understand how the different parts worked and what mattered in terms of how you were actually building these. So that's what I'm going to show you here is something really, really simple, but it is an editable block that will save and so forth and hopefully get you started with Gutenberg. If you're after the source code for this, it's the same deal with all my source code. Make it available to patrons. You can learn more about becoming a patron and getting access to this and all my other stuff at johnmorrisonline.com/Patreon. All right, so with that said, let's dive into this. The first thing that you need to do, of course, is make sure that you have Gutenberg, the plugin, activated or installed and activated. If you go to add new in WordPress and you just it's in the repository, so you can just do a search for Gutenberg and it should come up, and you can just install and activate it there. So that's the first thing that you need to do. And then let me show you real quick what our simple little block is going to do. So this is, once you install and activate Gutenberg, if we go to a page over here, I'll just leave this for a second, and you go to click in to edit a page, it actually takes you right into Gutenberg. So you can't use the other editor. That's something that's important to know. There's no switching, selecting if you want to use the classic or not. You just use Gutenberg once it's installed. So as I mentioned, there are these individual blocks that you can sort of use. You hit this plus button and you see a whole bunch of them over here. I've created a custom one called My First Block. And so you can see that showing up here. And if I click that, and I can click in here and I say this is some text, and I hit update, and we'll talk about why it's green here in just a second. But if I hit view post, you can see over here it says this is some text. So that's essentially what it allows you to do. The other nice thing is you can add another instance of this and hit update, and I've got two instances in the same post, and it saves them individually just fine. And I didn't have to do anything in terms of to make that work. It just sort of works with the way Gutenberg runs. So that's what we're going to create. You'll see in here we can do bold, italic, strike through. If we update that and we take a look, then you can see all that stuff is sort of saved. And so again, this is just a very, very basic block, but I want to give you sort of the core of how this actually works. So that's what we're headed towards. So let's go ahead and dive into the code. I am going to do pre-written code here because typing all of this out, I'd probably make this video about 3 times longer. So I'm going to stick to just going through what's already here and point out the important things that matter in terms of making this work. In terms of folder structure, I just have in my plugins folder, I have a folder called John Morris-Gutenberg, kind of like I always do. And then inside of that, there's a main plugin file, johnmorris-gutenberg.php. That's what you're looking at here. And then I've seen different ways of organizing this, but I just sort of made a blocks folder, and each block would have sort of its own individual folder. That may or may not be the best way to do it. Again, sort of play with that, but that's just the way that I'm sort of running with it for right now until I figure out a better way. So in here, I have a block. I'm just calling it My First Block, and you'll see we have a JavaScript file and 2 CSS files inside of that, and we'll explain what those reference here in just a second. So that's the basic folder structure. That's all I really have in here. I'm going to go ahead and close this just so we have a little more space here. So up at the top, this is a plugin. So I have my sort of normal plugin declaration here. I'm not going to go through that, but You can see it's just a normal, there's nothing special about it. This is just if someone tries to access this file directly, we'll quit. And then here we're doing a check for Gutenberg right off the bat to see if the plugin is installed. As Gutenberg is rolled into WordPress core, that's probably not going to be necessary. You can sort of assume that it's there eventually down the road, although there will be a transition period with that sort of thing. But if Gutenberg's not activated and you do try to start running some of this, like this particular function right here, you'll get a fatal error and it'll break your site. So you do need to do some sort of check here. I've just decided to check for what looks like the main Gutenberg function. If you go into the actual plugin editor, so if we go to the editor and we go into Gutenberg, you can see this Gutenberg project scene is the main entry point for the Gutenberg editor. So I just checked to see if that exists, if that function exists. If it does, then we'll do all of our stuff here. And if it doesn't, then we won't do anything. And it sort of makes it so it's compatible and so forth. Then I'm doing the standard to check to see if this function already exists. If it doesn't, then I'm going to create it. And so this is our main function here. We have one hook. You'll see we're hooking into the init hook, and our callback function is this JMO Gutenberg block. Okay, so this is where this is basically all of our PHP essentially, and this is where we're just registering everything. The actual blocks are going to be written in JavaScript in our JavaScript file. So this is just telling WordPress where to find all of the stuff it needs in order to add your custom block. We're not actually building the block with PHP, which I didn't really fully realize when I first started diving into this. All right, so the first kind of three things that we need to do here are actually standard things. We're calling WP register script, register style, and register style. So we're registering a script and we're registering two styles. That's been in WordPress forever. And so there's really nothing special about registering these scripts. However, the script in particular is going to be the thing that does all of the work for our block. So that's probably the most important part here. And so we're just calling WP register script like we always would. We're giving a name to our script as you normally would. We're giving the location, the URL where it can be found, and any dependencies. Now, this is one thing that is specific to Gutenberg. At a minimum, you have this WP blocks and WP element. These are required for to create a block. So you have to have these at a minimum. There are others that are available that you can add in, but again, I'm showing you bare bones what you have to do in order to get a block up and running. So you need WP blocks and WP elements. So you need those two dependencies. So when you put those as dependencies, then WordPress will automatically load them for you. So this registers our script. Again, that's the script. You can see it's editor-script.js. You can see that's what's right here, and we'll get into that. That's where we're going to spend most of our time. Here we're registering two styles. So the way the styles work is you can have a global style sheet, and then you can have an editor-specific style sheet. So the global style sheet will be loaded on both the front end and also in the editor. So you can sort of think of that as your base style sheet. And then the editor style sheet will, of course, only be loaded in the editor. So if you want to style the way the actual editor works different from the front end, then that's what you would do in that editor style sheet. So again, we're doing WP register style, the name of our style, unique name, of course, the location of the style, any dependencies. Again, we have a dependency that we need to use here, WP edit blocks. So we put that in there. And then this is the version number. Essentially what this does is it just makes sure that, I believe this one is every time the file m time is, I think every time this is edited, it will update the version. This just makes it so that the browser isn't caching the CSS file as we're in production. As you move out of production, this would probably be something that you want to get rid of so that you can leverage that caching. Same thing down here at WP register style, except this one now we're just we are registering our editor style. And we'll look at both of these in just a second, but it's the same thing: name, location, dependencies, and version. Okay, so all that stuff is just sort of standard WordPress stuff so far. You're just loading in a JavaScript file and 2 CSS files. Where we get unique to Gutenberg is where we do this register block type. And so this is sort of the main block registering thing that you need to do in PHP. So the first thing that you pass into this is the name of the block. And this is specific. They're very specific in the documentation that this needs to be namespaced the way it's done here. So it essentially needs to be the name of your plugin and then the name of your block. And that's to avoid any sort of conflicts with anybody else that is creating blocks. So, and it does need to be this slash like this. So that's important to keep in mind. They're very specific about that in the documentation. So again, the name of the block, unique name, and then we have an array here, and what we're essentially telling it is, hey, this is the editor script. So this is the one that we just registered. It's the name of that script. So when we set this name up here, that's what we pass in here. This is the editor style, and then this is the global style essentially. So we're just, all those files, all those JavaScript and CSS files we just registered, we're now just telling it, here's where to get all of this stuff. Okay, so that's what all of this is. And then of course we're running that on this init hook again. So that basically tells WordPress everything it needs to know in terms of PHP to load the correct CSS files, to name your block, all that sort of thing. And then where you actually create the block is in this editor script JavaScript file, which you can see here is actually a pretty small file. There's 29 lines of code to create a custom block. It's really not all that much. So, and then of course we have our 2 CSS files. We'll talk about those in just a second. So the first thing that we need to do is in JavaScript now, we need to register our block. And remember, we had those dependencies of WP blocks and WP element. And we use those right off the bat in here. So that's, again, why we need those dependencies. But we're using WP blocks dot register block type. So we're going to register a block type. And again, it's the name that we created in our PHP file, namespaced just like we did over there. Okay, so that's going to register our block type with that name. And then we need to give it a title. So I gave it my first block. If you come over here, we go to add, you can see that title, my first block. So that's where that comes from. Then we need to give it an icon. So you can use the dash icons that WordPress has available, which is what I've done here, or you can sort of create your own icon and load it in and so forth. Again, I want to show you bare bones, so I'm just using dash icons. You can go to dashicons.com, I believe it is, or you can just Google dash icons. And the one thing to note about if you're going to use dash icons is you see how it has dash icons dash palm tree. Just remove this dash icons dash part. Okay, just use the palm tree part or whatever it happens to be. Admin dash page. You see here I have welcome dash add dash page. So just use that. Next is a category. So you can put your blocks into different categories so they're a little bit easier to sort on the front end. Again, you can see we have blocks, we have embeds, we have different categories here. I've put it into common, which will put it in under this common blocks thing right here. But of course, you could put it wherever it makes sense. I believe you can create custom categories as well, but again, we're not going to get into that in this. All right, the final thing here is probably the most important part, which is the attributes part. So this is essentially telling Gutenberg how the data is going to be constructed. This is sort of a little bit of tricky, and this is probably the hardest part to understand about how Gutenberg works, especially if you've been a WordPress plugin developer. You're used to adding meta boxes to a post and storing data in that and using that. Gutenberg doesn't really work that way at all. The way that it works is ultimately all of the building that you do inside of Gutenberg, it gets stored in the post content field inside of the database. So you're not creating a new block and then saving the data for it as post meta or anything like that. It's all getting saved in post content. And what Gutenberg does is it essentially takes all of the information about how to render a particular page based off of the settings that you've set. So italicizing, and if you're adding images, all that stuff. It takes the content and the data, the information about how to render it is put into HTML comments, and all that is stored inside of post content. And then when a page is loaded, that post content field is grabbed and it's sort of run through Gutenberg and interpreted, and then Gutenberg essentially creates what's necessary for the HTML is necessary for the page to render on the front end. When you load it in the editor, it does the same thing, except it, as I understand it, turns it into JavaScript objects that the editor can then manipulate. So Gutenberg is basically doing interpreting of these HTML comments when you load it on the front end, when you load it in the editor, and so forth. So again, all the data is ultimately saved in the exact same place. And so we essentially have to tell Gutenberg how to interpret our block. And these attributes are part of how we do that. So essentially, we're telling it that our content, this content attribute, we're setting, hey, we have a content attribute, and the where you look for it is in the paragraph tag, and we're looking through the children of that paragraph tag. And Gutenberg understands that to be able to interpret it properly. Okay, and that sort of comes into play when we get into these save and edit functions. So there's a lot that you can learn. There's a lot of different ways that you can do this, attributes and types and all that sort of thing. It's one of the things that, again, I would recommend going through the documentation for Gutenberg. If you just Google Gutenberg handbook or something along those lines, you'll see that they have documentation that they're starting to build here. But in our particular case, we're just creating a really, really simple content attribute here. And then the final two things that you have to do is you have to tell Gutenberg what happens in the editor and what happens when it's saved. So essentially it's how the back end and the editing part, how the data is sort of handled, and then on the front end part, when it's saved, how it's handled. Okay. So we have this edit and we have this save that we have to specify for. And these are functions that we're creating here to tell Gutenberg what to do. Now, it's actually, because of all of this stuff is sort of baked in, it's actually really pretty straightforward to do this. So remember, we had that dependency of WP element over here. So we're going to leverage that now in this case. So we're going to use WP element, and we're going to create a new element. This is inside of the editor. So this is what's going to happen in the editor. And in this case, we're going to create a rich text block. So rich text is, again, something that's baked into Gutenberg already in the JavaScript dependencies that you're loading in. So you don't have to write all of that from scratch. You can leverage what's already there. And what rich text does is adds this bold, this italic, this strike through, this link. It adds that so that we can use that stuff. And you can, of course, add more in terms of alignment and so forth. All right, so we're going to create an element. The tag name, we're going to create a paragraph tag. Remember our selector up here. The class name, so when we use, you see here in our function, we have this properties. So this properties object. So when we use properties, Gutenberg will essentially create a class name for us. And so the way the class name works is, if we can actually see this in our style, it will prepend wp-block dash and then the name of our block that we gave it, and it substitutes, you can see here the slash. Remember, we had the slash down here. It substitutes a dash for that slash. Okay, so it's going to automatically create this class name, and if we just come over here and we can inspect this real quick, you can see we have a paragraph tag, and we have our class name is wp-block-jmo Gutenberg-myfirstblock. So Gutenberg does all of that automatically. So all you got to do to have it do that is again, use this props.className, and Gutenberg will take care of that for you. Then in the value, again, the data, the content that is entered into the editor gets saved as props.attributes.content, and it's sort of saved in memory. That's the important thing to understand here. It's not something that's saved to a database or anything like this. So this is all temporary. If you don't hit update over here, none of this is actually saved. Okay, so this is where you can actually, the text that it entered, when I entered, this is some text. This is where that can be accessed here, where you can get access to that. And then in the edit function, you have to do this on change event. So essentially, every time that this text is changed, then we need to have it actually updated in the editor. Okay, so the way we do that is on this onChange property here. Then we specify a function, and in that function, what's happening is the new content is being passed into the function, and so we're setting our attribute content to what that new content is. Okay, so we're essentially telling Gutenberg, when someone enters new content, that new content is now the content for this attribute. Okay, that it is this attribute that we've specified up here. I know a lot of this sounds complicated. If you've used React before, then this will probably sound familiar to you. I've never used React, so a lot of this took me a while to sort of get my head around. But essentially, whenever you update content, it's going to update the attribute properly so that it'll display properly in the editor, and we can save it and all that sort of stuff. Okay, the big things here is this: when you call this attribute content, then you need to come down here and make sure that the value is being set to props.attributes.content, and in here where you're specifying that you're going to set an attribute, that attribute you're setting is content. So whatever you named this also has to show up, be what this is and what this is. Okay, so that's sort of the important pathway to keep in mind with this. In the save function, then, what we're doing is we're essentially telling Gutenberg how to save this. And so you can see here what we're doing is we're creating an element. Now we're creating a paragraph tag, right? Because that's what we are telling Gutenberg that this block is. We're describing what the data is. It's a paragraph tag. So we're creating a paragraph tag. We're giving it a class name of, again, props.className, just like we did up here. And we're setting the data, the content, to props.attributes.content. So that what essentially that does is when Gutenberg goes to save this, it tells it how to save it. It says, create a paragraph tag, give it this class name, and here's the content of that paragraph tag. Now, one of the things that, if you've messed with this at all, that I want to sort of point out here is if you look at the documentation, right, and you can see I'm sort of going through what's in the documentation, but you'll see here that it says to create wp-blocks.richtext.content. So it's saying use .richtext.content for when you have a block that is a rich text block, because it'll save it more properly. It'll keep there from being any sort of issues with how the block is saved. The problem with that I've noticed is that for me so far, when I do that, and I'm sort of I'm learning this along with you, so I don't want to claim like I'm some big expert on this, but I'm learning this along with you. But what I noticed is when I do that, it doesn't save it for some reason. So I don't know if there's something about the way that I'm doing it, although I've taken it pretty much verbatim from there and put it in and tried it, and it still didn't work. So in order for me to get it to save, I actually had to create a paragraph element specifically, as opposed to creating this rich text content, or using this functionality this function that's available inside of Gutenberg. So that's something that as I move forward with doing more of these and I learn more about it and dig more into it, it may update and so forth. But as of right now, to get it to work, I needed to create this paragraph tag and then pass in these attributes. But again, the idea is the same thing, that when we save it, we tell it to save it as a paragraph tag with a class name, and this is the content. And so what that ultimately then allows Gutenberg to do is save it properly into the database in that post content field, and then know how to pull it back out of that post content field and render it properly on the front end. So that's sort of the nuts and bolts, or the core of creating a new element. If this is your first time looking at this and it sort of is maybe a little over your head, don't worry. Read the documentation, maybe watch the video again. It took me a few times reading through it to start to understand what was going on. The other thing that I wanted to point out is we talked about the styles. So remember, we have this class that gets created, and this style sheet, the style.css, we register that as our global style sheet. So you can see here I have this set to color blue. I have the background set to a bluish color, the border color set to a bluish color, and I've set the border width and the padding in this style.css. And if we look at this on, go ahead and update it. If we look at this on the front end, you can see here it's blue. And so we have blue text, blue background, blue border. But if we go to the editor, it's green. And the reason why is, if I go over to editor.style.css, I change the color, the background, and the border color all to green. And that's just to simply show you an example of how the different style sheets work. So this one will be loaded front and back end, but because I've overridden it here, now that's what's changing it to green. So if we get rid of this and we come back here to our sample page, now you can see it's blue because I'm not overriding it anymore. So again, that's what allows you in your CSS to manage how it looks on the front end versus how it looks on the back end. So that's the last thing that I wanted to point out to you. All right, so that is creating your first content block, or your first block inside of Gutenberg. I know, again, if you haven't really messed with React all that much, it's probably a little sort of hot and heavy and fast and furious coming at you. But like I said, look through the documentation, maybe watch the video again to sort of go through it and hopefully start to understand how to build these blocks. This is a really simple one. If you look at any of the written tutorials out there, they get really sort of complicated, and you can sort of move into that. But again, for me, I wanted to know just what the basic thing that I needed to get something up and going is, and this is it. So hopefully you got something out of that. If you did, I'd appreciate if you'd hit the like button. Also, again, if you want the source code and you want to support what I do here on the channel, I'd appreciate if you become a patron of the show over on Patreon at johnmorrisonline.com/Patreon. You get access to the source code. You get access to all my past and future courses, WordPress plugin course that I have, which I would highly recommend to you, PHP courses, freelancing, Upwork, all that stuff. Again, you can learn more about that at johnmorrisonline.com/Patreon. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. Also, make sure and ring the bell so that you get notified when I actually get notified when I post new videos. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.